welcome to Navigating the Vortex, Ethnopolitics edition. I am Maria Rokarzanaki from the Institute of Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg here in Germany.
And I'm Stefan Wolf from the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. In today's edition, we have two guests. Tamiraz Fakouri joins us from Massachusetts in the United States, where she works as Associate Professor of International Politics and Conflict at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. And joining us from Northern Ireland is John Nagle, who is Professor of Sociology at Queen's University Belfast, as well as a Fellow of the Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice, and an Associate Fellow at the Institute of Irish Studies. Welcome to our podcast, Tamiraz and John.
Thank you for having me. Delighted to be part of Navigating the Vortex.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and welcome to Belfast as well.
So the latest edition of Ethnopolitics is a special issue that John co-edited with Simon Maybon from the University of Lancaster in the UK. And the title is Contesting Power Sharing, Contentious Politics in Divided Societies. And it also contains an article from Tamiraz on how do semi-authoritarian regimes defeat uprisings, which focuses on Lebanon's 2019 uprising. And you have both worked on power sharing, contentious politics and divided societies for many years. And in fact, John, you published an article in our journal back in 2009 on neoliberalism and peace building in Northern Ireland. So before we dive into our latest edition of Ethnopolitics, can you both tell our listeners a bit more about how you became interested in these topics?
Okay,
perhaps John can start? Yeah, sure.
Great, thanks. So thank you for flagging up my article from 2009, because I want to kind of highlight what I've been doing research on divided societies for over 2 decades. And as you know, divided societies are places which have an ethno-nationalist cleavage. But I've always been interested in the types of mobilization which occur outside of these ethno-nationalist frameworks, especially kind of groups who form cross-cleavage, non-sectarian politics, whether it's feminists, LGBTQ+, trade unionists. And I think these movements have often been ignored in research in divided societies. So I want to know how they sort of mobilize and what impact they have on divisions. And through doing this research, that has drawn me towards a second research agenda, which is the interrelationship between protest and consociational power sharing in divided societies. So as we know, the dominant framework for consociational power sharing is that it's very much a top-down form of conflict management, and the voice of everyday people has often been obscured or minimized within this framework. I know more recent research has looked at citizen assemblies and how ordinary people can be represented within these sort of power sharing frameworks. But at the same time, there's so much sort of mobilization in relationship to power sharing, not just the types of mass mobilization we've seen in Lebanon and Iraq in the last few years, but all types of kind of mobilization, whether it's in terms of supporting power sharing agreements, looking for changes in relationship towards corruption, public resources, mobilization in terms of rights for all sorts of groups, whether it be LGBTQ, feminists, migrants and refugees. So this is my interest in this interesting relationship between consociational power sharing and protest.
Tamiraz, would you like to tell us more about it?
Yes, of course. So thank you for this great question. So for me, it's a really deeply personal affair, I would say. So I grew up during the 1975-1990 civil war in Lebanon, and I really witnessed firsthand what it means for a country to be physically and socially divided. So I grew up in Mount Lebanon, and I visited Beirut only when I turned 12. And a bit later, I really experienced the realities of a divided capital, a city that was split between East and West. So when the war ended, I watched another kind of tension unfold, really this interplay between conflict resolution, post-war reconstruction, and also the drive towards democratization in post-war Lebanon. And as you know, Lebanon's 1989 power-sharing agreement, the Ta'if agreement, was negotiated behind closed doors. And this sparked a long-standing debate among us about whether the transition from war to peace would have looked differently had ordinary people been part of the process. So really, this political backdrop is what drew me to questions of how societies move from war to peace and the governance dilemmas that accompany those transitions. So as John said, power sharing is often treated as the leading framework for conflict resolution after war because it's supposed to guarantee representation and veto rights to groups that are central to the conflict. And existing research has already told us a great deal about whether power sharing prevents recurrence of conflicts. So my contribution has been really to look at how power sharing behaves in practice, how it operates under pressure, how it adapts or fails to adapt, and how it sometimes hardens in the face of bottom-up change. So I try to bring this kind of lived sense of how it is to live under a sectarian power sharing regime. And for me, the paradox is why power sharing keeps going, even though it's clearly not working in places such as Lebanon or Iraq. And one of my core findings is while sectarian power sharing may help institutionalize negotiation as a political norm, it generates what I call recurring governance traps. And these traps reproduce old fault lines, but they also create new ones, locking politics into what I call the consociational wheel of fortune. I'll stop here.
Excellent. Thank you. I mean, that's a really interesting sort of intellectual journeys that you both have had. Now, let's focus a little bit on the special issue that you have devoted to these topics. John, in the introduction, you and Simon asked the question whether it is possible to view protest as having the capacity to progress democracy and inclusivity in divided society. In answer to this question, you set up a spectrum that ranges from protests that articulate, as you call it, hardline ethnic interests, and that can therefore undermine power-sharing agreements on one end. And then you have the citizen-led protest that crosses ethnic cleavages and can therefore open up space for the healthy reform of power-sharing institutions on the other end of that spectrum. Now, across this, you identify 4 categories of protest. Can you briefly tell us what they are and maybe illustrate them with a few examples?
Thanks. So yes, we introduced a spectrum of protest in the context of consociational power sharing. So firstly, we have supportive protest. So this is where citizens mobilize to protect power-sharing institutions. So this can actually occur towards the end of power-sharing. Life kind of spans when power-sharing systems become under threat. They're beginning to sort of weaken. So citizens can actually come to the streets to try to bolster power sharing, or occasionally when power sharing becomes dysfunctional or prone to paralysis. So we've seen this in Northern Ireland in the last few years where power sharing has broken down. So what we've seen in response is protest movements demand that politicians get back into government and take their place in the power sharing executive. Or supportive protests can actually begin at the very beginning of power sharing. So, for example, during the referendum for the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, a large swathe of the citizenship here in Belfast and across Northern Ireland demanded that the respective ethno-nationalist elites accept the terms of the Good Friday Agreement and take up power sharing. So that's kind of supportive. Reformist is the second type of protest, and this is where protest movements demand some sort of reform from power sharing institutions. So it could be around corruption, the delivery of public services, or it could be about where kind of power sharing is not particularly working so well for people. So an example of this would be protests in Iraq in 2015, where Iraqis were demanding the power sharing elites do something about the delivery of electricity. Or at the same time in Lebanon, the East Link protests. So what happened in Beirut and across Lebanon, the power sharing agreement and pact was unable to come to some sort of agreement about managing waste. So all of this accumulated waste was on the streets of Beirut. So people took to the streets to demand reforms of kind of power sharing to deal with these particular issues. So the third form of protest would be oppositional. So this is where protest movements demand an end to power sharing. So this is hardline revolutionary action. So for example, during the Fawr protest in Lebanon in 2019, protesters were calling for the power sharing government to be overthrown and for a more inclusive form of democracy to take place. The final part of the protest spectrum would be inclusionary protests. So as we know, kind of power sharing agreements often de facto exclude certain types of issues and groups, whether it's LGBTQ rights, gender equality, rights for migrants, and so on. So inclusionary protests would be where these groups who are marginalized and excluded from power sharing demand inclusion and rights within the system. One thing which I would point out here is these protest forms are not meant to be seen in isolation. I think they're related and they interlink together. So in some cases, reformist protests may develop in the long term into oppositional protests. And oppositional protests may be met by supportive protest. This was very clearly seen in places like Lebanon and Iraq in 2019. So when protesters demanded the end to power sharing, sections of the public allied to the elites came out to support power sharing. So we need to think about this in terms of this dynamic interrelationship.
Sure.
Excellent. I mean, that's a really good way of setting the scene. And Tamiras, I mean, you take a slightly different but very complementary perspective by basically discussing how an incumbent power-sharing regime responds to any or all of these kinds of protests when they happen. So in your article, you look at political performances as important techniques of power through which the post-war regime governs dissent while re-engineering its survival. So from your perspective, what is it about these political performances that interests you, and why are they important in the repertoire of techniques that regimes can use to essentially defeat protest movements?
Yeah. So as I said earlier, I'm really interested in why power sharing persists in certain contexts, even though it has a poor governance record, such as Lebanon or Iraq, and even when there is strong bottom-up contention. So in this article that I published in Ethnopolitics, in a special issue, I offer a different way of thinking about the resilience of sectarian power sharing. As you know, a lot of explanations for resilient political orders focus really on repression in the Middle East. So what I do instead is that I shift the gaze towards performative politics, toward the political performances that ruling elites deploy. And I draw on Lebanon's 2019 uprising, what is called the Sawra, the revolution, which was really an unprecedented oppositional protest movement in the country's modern history, to borrow from John Nagel's taxonomy. And I show that elite cartels managed to demobilize contention not just through coercion, but through a complex repertoire of performances that have evolved over time. So Lebanon's power sharing has often been mischaracterized as a consociational democracy, but in reality it has evolved into a semi-authoritarian hybrid. So it blends pluralistic features with authoritarian practices. And within the system, ruling elites do rely on some coercive tools, but also they rely on subtle techniques of power to weaken and fragment protest movements. And in my article, I identify 3 such performances that I will review very quickly. First of all, I look at how elites enact unresponsiveness. So they acknowledge, for instance, grievances rhetorically, but they avoid substantive engagement. They issue vague promises and they perform inaction in the middle of a colossal financial crisis which has wiped away citizens' savings. They also offer superficial reforms like revoking the WhatsApp tax when the first protest broke out without any credible reform plan. And I show how this policy immobilism exhausts protesters. It divides them. Some of the people I spoke to, in the light of this policy immobilism, they became convinced that perhaps taking to the streets or blocking the streets is not the best way to go forward, because this is hampering, their children going to school, for instance. So it shifts people's focus to survival. But at the same time, it further stokes contention and it further, fuels this feeling of indignation. So the second performance I focus on is what I call, staging spectral dangers or fictional dangers. So elites, start invoking threats like civil war, foreign meddling, or sectarian strife to delegitimize protests, and also at some points to justify security interventions. And this, creates a context for counter movements to arise. They feel that, they are trying to redeem or reestablish order. And in this light, also, the sectarian elites start positioning themselves as the guardians of stability and the guardians of civil peace. And the third performance I look at is how elites script also alternative crises. So this performance, for instance, blurs responsibility over the real roots of rage that have fueled the uprising. So sectarian leaders deflect attention from domestic grievances and from their own role in Lebanon's collapse, and they reframe the crisis as geopolitical, or they shift blame to external actors, including refugees. So in other words, they manufacture distraction. So I claim that if we want really to understand how the power-sharing regime endures without, repression, we need to look sometimes beyond formal institutions, beyond overt repression, and we need to pay attention to the performances through which elites shape meaning, but also manage dissent and re-engineer their own survival. And I also argue that these performances influence how the protest cycle unfolds over time, because they both curtail but also stoke more protest or contention. So finally, I'd like to say that my article really makes 2, contributions. First, it kind of, tries to foreground the performative dimensions of authoritarianism within power sharing, including Iraq or Lebanon and potentially Bosnia-Herzegovina. And second, it reframes how we think about protest outcomes. So instead of focusing only on immediate wins or losses, or really on kind of putting the onus on protesters themselves, it pushes us to think about the apparatus of defeat. I borrowed this from Michael Hart, to consider the broader forces that are sometimes, very structural, but also performative, and that shape contention in post-war states, even when activists remain deeply committed to imagining, potential futures for Lebanon.
Thank you, Damiras. This was really a fascinating approach. And now I would like to go back to the category of inclusionary protests by groups that are usually marginalized and excluded from consociationalism. So women's groups, LGBTQ movements, migrants. And as you say in your introduction, John, inclusionary protests are calls by non-ethnic citizens for human rights and recognition. And these others come together to demand that consociations allow non-ethnically identified citizens to run for key executive posts exclusively reserved for ethnic groups. Can you tell us more about these groups' particular needs to be able to protest and what their inclusion in a consociational system might look like in practice?
Yep, great question. So as you just mentioned, consociations are very good at guaranteeing rights and representation for the main ethno-nationalist groups, and it kind of solves the security dilemma which often causes civil war and interstate conflict. But the trade-off for this is that consociations tacitly exclude non-ethnic or non-ethno-nationalist groups and issues, whether it's LGBTQ rights, reproductive rights, rights for individuals and groups who don't necessarily define themselves as ethnic. So I think these groups who are excluded will want to have their rights and identities recognized within consociational frameworks, but at the same time they face a double hurdle. And the first hurdle is formally, I think consociations often reserve offices and rules for recognized peoples and communities. So in some contexts, you literally can't run for certain posts unless you fit the category. Bosnia would be a clear example of this, where so-called non-ethnic others have challenged constitutional exclusion from top offices, especially through forms of legal mobilization. Secondly, informally, the rules of consociation is problematic for these excluded groups. So even where rights exist on paper, participation is filtered through patronage networks, policing. Jobs and services can depend on party brokers, and some identities are treated as morally suspect. So what do these inclusionary groups need to do to protest? I think firstly we need safety and protection, legal support, monitoring, alliances that reduce personal costs, visibility. Secondly, we could look towards organizational infrastructure. So spaces that aren't controlled by the ethnic or sectarian party system, including NGOs and unions to informal networks. And then third, kind of coalitional leverage, which is linking equality and recognition to wider governance failures. So this includes corruption, services, deadlock. So the movement can broaden its appeal and avoid being isolated. So this makes me kind of think, what would this actually look like, this inclusion in practice? And for me, it's not just symbolic tolerance, it's equality with teeth. So it gives access to key offices and decision-making without ethnic designation within power sharing systems, anti-discrimination enforcement, welfare and services delivered as rights of citizenship rather than as rewards for communal loyalty. And in short, I would argue that moving from managed diversity to equal citizenship within and sometimes against the logic of consociation is key to the long-term success of consociations and how they accommodate these non-ethnic others.
Amiraz, would you like to add anything on this? The two of you also co-authored the book Resisting Sectarianism, Queer Activism in Post-War Lebanon, which shows that LGBTQ and feminist social movements play a major role in Lebanon's political and social transformation. And also, to what extent does the power of these movements in Lebanon relate to the non-binary understanding of the success or failure of social movements? And I'm asking this because this non-binary nature of success and failure is one of the main arguments that you put forth in your article in the special issue.
Yes, absolutely. I'd love to talk briefly about the book Resisting Sectarianism, Queer Activism in Post-War Lebanon, and how it pushes us to think about agency and change beyond the usual binary of success or defeat. And it aligns to a great extent, with one of the ideas brought forward in the special issue, how we can look at agency beyond success or failure. So in the book, John and I look at the agency of LGBTQ plus movements that operate really in a very constrictive power-sharing settings, such as Lebanon's. And one of our main goals is really to challenge the idea that these communities are passive bystanders. And we actually try to see how they navigate constraint and agency at the same time, how they contest laws, how they challenge everyday practices, and how they carve out political space in ways that are often overlooked. And beyond the usual metrics of success or failure, we show that LGBTQ communities in Lebanon are key democratizing actors because of several reasons. And I'd like to give you a couple of examples. For instance, they're not just fighting for identity-based rights. So in my field research, I found out that their claims making goes much further. So, the queer activists I was able to interview placed their struggle right at the center of debates about accountable governance, something that is shared by all citizens in Lebanon. So their activism also touches on health reforms, on waste management, on electricity, on environmental justice, even banking sector reforms. So their political imagination or their queer utopias, have a lot to teach us about what a new Lebanon could look like. And this also means rethinking how we measure change. So yes, legal and policy concessions matter, but what about the cognitive and the cultural legacies that social movements and protest movements leave behind? What about the intersectional solidarities they build? So during Lebanon's 2019 Thawra, the queer movements forged strong alliances with feminist groups, migrant rights organizations, refugee-centric initiatives, and environmental activists. And this activism was not born overnight. So here we try also to overcome this perspective of a presentist, analysis of queer movements or social movements, because their activism, really relies on precursory temporalities. And it's also important to look at these subterranean, currents of activism and to go beyond, the spectacular moments when people take to the streets, I would think. And so a key point we also make is that changing laws around, intimate and sexual rights is only part of the story. And anti-sectarianism for many of these activists is a daily act of resistance. It's really about, unmaking the logic of sectarianism. It's really about reversing clientelist networks, elite bargains, the patronage networks that John spoke about, and even, denouncing those subtle discriminatory practices like who gets hired, who can apply for a job, who gets turned down, who gets to buy property, who gets to access a certain upscale bar in Beirut. Right. So this is an ongoing act of questioning, resistance and insurgency. And finally, I would just like to say that we try to debunk this idea that there's just one single way to understand LGBTQ activism. We're dealing with a continuum of activisms. It could be about legal visibility and advocacy, legal mobilization, a key repertoire that John alluded to. But it could also be about, prioritizing service provision, emergency assistance, creating safe spaces, like convening storytelling nights, navigating bureaucracies, or simply just holding space for one another. So what we see actually is that there is visible, protests, but there is also underground activism, which is incredibly important for these queer movements, and that many of these initiatives draw on art, theater, and literature as forms of uninstitutionalized resistance that are really central to their tactical repertoire in a power-sharing regime such as Lebanon.
John, you and your co-author, Kira Murdoch, who is an assistant professor in comparative and Irish politics at Villanova University in Pennsylvania in the US, you pick up on some of those themes. You use the case of Northern Ireland to illustrate this very point that, and I quote here, the citizenship regime of power sharing is based on an inclusion-exclusion dynamic that generates structurally differentiated citizenship. While the main ethno-sectarian groups are privileged, groups and individuals that are not defined in ethnic categories find themselves on the periphery of the body politic. Now, Northern Ireland, it seems to me, is a case where this particular kind of exclusion of marginalized groups like LGBTQ community is actually one of the few areas where power-sharing elites often seem to find it relatively easy to agree. So what can we actually learn from Northern Ireland as a kind of protest case by LGBTQ plus communities? How can these communities make their voices heard, and how can they make them matter?
Great, thanks. It's a really important question. So if I could zoom out quickly and give a broader perspective, I've been doing research for a number of years on civil war and war orders and what happens to LGBTQ populations. And it's often the case that within civil wars and interstate conflicts, ethno-nationalist groups may violently attack LGBT communities. So there's research on this in terms of Colombia, Syria, Iraq, and we're also beginning to get a picture of what happened in Northern Ireland during the conflict itself, where LGBTQ population was deliberately targeted. So in some cases, LGBTQ people were assassinated, gay bars were attacked by paramilitaries, paramilitaries excluded LGBTQ people from communities. So I think what I'm trying to build up a bit of a picture here is that these civil war legacies can bleed into the post-conflict order, and particularly within power sharing, because unfortunately what happens is that many of the ethno-nationalist kind of groups who had hardline attitudes towards homosexuality and LGBT communities end up being empowered within power sharing systems. And I think Northern Ireland is a case study to make us think about these issues and to consider how these legacies of homophobia are still prevalent in this post-conflict society. So what I'm trying to argue in terms of the sexual citizenship with my co-author Sarah Murder is it's not just purely about exclusion of LGBTQ people. I think there's actually a hegemonic order within the sort of power sharing system here in Northern Ireland which re-entrenches patriarchy and heteronormative values. So in order for LGBTQ mobilization to gain kind of space within the system, it's not about purely demanding rights and recognition. It's also about kind of challenging these underlying values of homophobia, heteronormativity, which unfortunately some ethno-nationalist elites still kind of reproduce. And we've seen this, within the kind of power sharing system. Reproductive rights, same-sex marriage have become major issues of contestation within the executive. And, unfortunately, we've seen a situation in which reproductive rights and same-sex marriage has been delayed because of these conflicts, these kind of culture wars which continue to be manifest within the power sharing system. So I think what we're trying to alert readers to is it's not just purely about the exclusion of particular groups, but it's the way in which kind of power sharing systems, unfortunately, may reproduce certain sorts of values which make it incredibly hard for certain groups to kind of find space. And I don't think it's just purely about LGBTQ rights. It's also about feminist issues. As I just mentioned, reproductive rights has been one of these sort of issues which has been often put on the back burner.
You outlined two key areas for future exploration. And the first is how macro-institutional differences across power-sharing institutions shape the form of protest. And the second is protest outcomes. Could you explain to our listeners what you mean by macro-institutional differences and how do these differences shape protest forms?
Yeah, of course. Great, thanks. I should be clear that I borrow this term macro-institutional from Alison McCulloch and Joanne McAvoy, who kind of alerted us to the fact that constitutional power sharing is never identikit. It's always made to kind of fit for specific issues of each divided society. And one way we can think about these macro-institutional differences, of course, is this division between corporate and liberal kind of power sharing. So kind of corporate means forms of kind of power sharing which entrench ethnic and ethno-nationalist ideas by guaranteeing rights and representation for the main ethno-nationalist groups. Liberal, on the other hand, gives an opportunity for issues and rights to emerge through electoral competition. But corporate and liberal make us think about what are the opportunities for social movements to mobilize within these two different types of systems. So, I mean, we could hypothesize that corporate systems make it incredibly hard for inclusionary sort of protests because there isn't really kind of space within the system for this. So does this mean that movements who are excluded are more likely to take much more radical repertoires of contention, street protest, joining oppositional kind of forms of protest? On the other hand, do we think about liberal systems as providing more opportunities for groups to gain space within the system? So that's one way in which we can kind of think about this. I think another way for us to take the debate forward is by taking on board Tamaras's really valid points about how some power sharing systems, especially Lebanon and Iraq, have become semi-authoritarian. You know, for example, that the elites within these sort of power sharing systems are beginning to close down the space for civil society. They're beginning to rig elections. They're using the sort of media networks to dominate media space. So it's not always just purely about the power sharing system itself, but also we need to consider how it links to some of these other dimensions, such as repressive practices being used by the power sharing elites, how they close down the space for civil society and for media networks and so on. But I think kind of Tamaras could really speak to this more because I know that's where her research is also going.
Well, that's a perfect segue into my next question, which is exactly about this sort of second part of your research agenda, which, by the way, you describe very interestingly as your call for a fruitful conversation between power sharing and protest scholarship. And I think what you already hinted at here and what Tamaras's article and also what you said earlier really speaks to very well is different types of outcomes of protest that we can see across a range of different power sharing regimes. So question to you specifically, Tamaras, then is, do you agree that, first of all, this is a productive research agenda, which I assume you do, but what insights specifically do you think you can get from that, both for Lebanon, but also more broadly for this wider conversation between protest and power sharing?
Absolutely. So, of course, I think that this is a very productive research agenda. And I just wanted to add that, classical power sharing theory has really focused on elite bargains and elite leadership. And there is this kind of impression, that this classical power sharing theory has not really, looked at the challenges that confront consociationalism and has not really factored in a space for bottom-up agency, and hence the importance of this growing conversation on inclusive governance in order to decenter power sharing away from this elite, coalescence or elite leadership and delve more into the intricate dynamics of societies and, the increasing challenges brought about, by also global governance and its effects, on the so-called nation state. So I think that, whenever we talk about power sharing, we're really talking about a system built on elite bargains, right? Leaders negotiating among themselves on behalf of their communities to keep ethno-sectarian divides in check. But there's this, a whole new research, including the special issue, that shows that when power sharing is really centered on elites, it sidelines totally the people on the ground. So power sharing agreements are often hammered out under pressure, such as the Ta'if power sharing agreement I've talked about, but also to a certain extent the 1995 Dayton, agreement. There's the rush to end the war. There's this urgency that comes at a cost. It limits who gets to shape the post-war power sharing transition. And it means that everyday acts of care, solidarity, and peace, the things ordinary people do, rarely make it into the picture, of power sharing peace. So by bringing power sharing studies into conversation with protest scholarship and even the wider social movement scholarship, I think we open up the frame big time. We widen what we mean by policy change. We widen what we mean by agency, and we also widen what we mean by peace building or post-conflict peace building beyond elite-centric institutions or even external actors, peace building packages. So instead of measuring success or failure only through big political breakthroughs such as ceasefires or political settlements, we really start paying attention to the microdynamics of agency, what Roger McKenzie talks about, for instance, or the repertoires of action that people improvise in their daily lives. And a lot of social and protest scholarship often reminds us that political change is not only about institutional engineering, it's also about the contentious, creative, and sometimes quiet ways people push back and really imagine alternatives or political futures. And my last point is that beyond the iconic moments of mass protest, I wanted to kind of perhaps call for looking also at the less spectacular acts, beyond the iconic protest movements. Take, for instance, Lebanon's protracted emergencies, such as the 2020 port explosion. So as the 2019 Thawra slowly faded, we thought that, contention was out of the picture. But, people rushed to kind of negotiate contention through other ways. In the context of the 2020 port explosion, they rushed to sweep streets, they cleared rubble, they coordinated donations of brooms, helmets, shovels, and bags. So these aren't really grand repertoires of contention, and perhaps they don't make it, in the protest scholarship, but they're precisely also the kinds of acts through which sectarian power sharing gets disrupted in everyday life.
Yes, great. And this really leads me to the next question about the wave of protests that we're experiencing now around the world. So both in societies with power sharing, but also in authoritarian regimes. And you mentioned earlier also that Lebanon is this now turning to a semi-authoritarian kind of regime. And in light of increasing polarization and radicalization within societies, exacerbated by geopolitical rivalry and increased proxy warfare in already volatile power-sharing settings like Iraq, like Lebanon and Bosnia-Herzegovina, what are the policy implications of this research? And finally, are the findings applicable and transferable to broader political contexts without power-sharing systems, so in authoritarian or totalitarian regimes? Perhaps John can start?
Yeah, great, thanks. So I want to be clear by saying that I'm a supporter of constitutional power sharing, but I think of myself as a critical friend. So one of the things which I want to put forward here is that power sharing scholarship and power sharing designers shouldn't be afraid of protests. In many ways, protests can actually be a good thing. You know, it enhances democratization and the performance of power sharing. You know, what protests can do, it can raise new issues, bring to the forefront the claims of groups who are excluded. It can illuminate issues around clientelism, corruption. So, you know, we should get away from thinking of kind of power sharing as destabilizing, which I think power sharing scholarship has always been worried about when it comes to protest. So kind of following from that, I think there are some policy implications we could consider. So I think one core implication is that stability and inclusion are not necessarily the same thing. So I think power sharing can reduce violence, yet still reproduce exclusion, corruption and weak service delivery, which then becomes this recurring feature and driver protest. And you see that in very concrete ways in places like Iraq, where service failures over electricity and jobs drove kind of protests and widened into a kind of critique of a power sharing system. So what we can consider here is whether external actors care about long-term peace, and if they do so, we should treat equal citizenship and accountable governance essential and not just optional extras, because exclusion doesn't just offend democratic norms. I think they undermine the settlement's legitimacy over time. So I think, you know, one of the policy kind of consequences here is that we need to kind of take seriously the positive effects of protest. So on transferability, I think many dynamics actually kind of travel across case studies, whether it's repression, co-option, the management of cleavage politics, but perhaps the kind of landing pads differ. So in power sharing settings, protest sometimes has institutional routes such as courts, political parties, coalition and bargaining, even if that's imperfect. Whereas more authoritarian contexts, there might be fewer channels for protests to translate into reform. So outcomes depend even more on regime strategies and external leverage. So movements in non-power sharing contexts can be contained through managed elections, selective concessions, and targeted repression. But pressure also comes to the fore when opposition coalitions stay united and outside actors really do have leverage, such as through aid, sanctions, or diplomatic conditionality. So I think, there is transferability for the case studies which have been explored within this special issue.
Ramirez, would you like to say something about it?
Yes, I'd love to say something. I think this is a very important question to talk about the transferability of lessons or takeaways from the special issue. And of course, I'd like to say that my article may focus on Lebanon and the performative politics that ruling incumbents deploy or play. But the argument speaks to a much wider comparative debate. And Lebanon's power sharing system has too often been siloed, as an exception in broader Middle East, North Africa discussions. But I think that this exceptionalism is really misleading because many of the dynamics we see in Lebanon, elite-driven governance, decentralized, fuzzy power, protracted emergencies, and these recurring cycles of contention are not unique at all. They resonate really across political systems, such as Iraq, but also far beyond the Middle East. So one of the things I think applies for a broader set of cases is that we're seeing nowadays that states don't securitize contention only through overt repression. So in many semi-authoritarian settings, in many world regions, the repertoire is becoming far more insidious, subtle and layered. One strategy that I noticed, for instance, is to turn protests into a geopolitical game. So to brand activists as threats to public order or as as agendas or as agents of foreign agendas. So we saw this clearly in how officials framed the Arab Spring uprisings. And I'm talking about Syria. I'm also talking about officials, in Tunisia, in Egypt, but also, currently Iranian protests as being framed as sites of external meddling. And we continue to see everyday crackdowns on journalists, activists, and even refugees, all justified under the banner of preserving stability, geopolitical stability. So there's this quieter register of securitization also that is just as important, that I try to attract attention to and that I would like also to keep researching. It's the practice of pushing certain demands down the policy ladder by portraying the state as overwhelmed by security and geopolitical pressures. A good example is how debates around LGBTQ rights are routinely dismissed as not timely, not relevant, not important, because, states are facing more urgent existential threats. So this kind of policy prioritization sidelines entire communities, not only in Lebanon, not only in power-sharing states. And they show that regimes can suppress dissent without resorting to full-scale repression just by redefining what counts, who counts as a legitimate political actor, and which issues are even allowed to enter the policy arena. So I think this kind of perspective speaks to a broader question, about complex forms of statecraft, whether we're talking about the global north or the global south, and how this interacts with citizens' agencies. And I'd even push the question further. I would say that this isn't only about authoritarian or semi-authoritarian regimes, but it's also about the broader question of how democracy is dying. So around the world, kind of managing contention is done in a subtle way through the gradual erosion of freedoms, through the narrowing of civil space, through the internalization of self-censorship. So we're also seeing democracies die at the ballot box, quote unquote. Elections are happening, but within heavily restricted political environments. And even in so-called consolidated democracies, political elites increasingly perform indifference towards citizens' demands and strategically deprioritize, them in policy cycles. So from this perspective, I think that these questions really speak to complex forms of political power in today's world, and about how, securitization has become really a way of governing contention and governing people's possibilities for social and political change.
Great insights, really. And now I would like to thank you very much, Tamiras and John, for this fascinating discussion. We really learned a lot today, and I hope that our listeners did too.
And speaking of our listeners, many thanks to all of you as well. We hope you enjoyed the second episode of Navigating the Vortex Ethnopolitics edition. John's co-edited special issue, Contesting Power Sharing, Contentious Politics in Divided Societies, is now available as issue 2 of the current volume of Ethnopolitics. His co-authored article on contesting power sharing, LGBTQ+ activism, and the Sexual Citizenship of Consociationalism has been published open access in this special issue as well. And Tamiras's article in this special issue, How Do Semi-Authoritarian Regimes Defeat Uprisings? Lebanon's 2019 uprising and the dramaturgical performances that the post-Civil War regime plays, is also available open access, and you can find links to all of them in the show notes.
You'll also be able to read the full version of our conversation with Tamiras and John on our website. You can sign up to our newsletter for free at navigatingthevortex.com.
And signing up to the newsletter is the best way to make sure you don't miss out on anything, and you'll get future episodes delivered straight to your inbox wherever you are in the world. We hope you'll share Navigating the Vortex Ethnopolitics edition with anyone you might think find it of interest. If you like the show, please consider rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you are listening. Until next time, it's goodbye from me in Birmingham.
Goodbye from Hamburg.
Goodbye from me in Medford.
Goodbye from me in Belfast.